opened in 2021, the Belger Glass Annex. And so that's our newest location, a hot shop for glass blowing. We teach classes there. And I also mentioned that location specifically because pretty soon after we opened the Belger Glass Annex, we started hosting Heartland, a regional glass show. So the name Heartland, as it suggests, is regionally from kind of the Midwest, Great Plains area. And last year in April, Kate's piece was included in Heartland 6 and won Best in Show. So at that time, she was supposed to give a talk and demonstration. Things got in the way. So we're so excited that tonight we're able to have that talk from Kate. And we also do have a piece by her, not the piece that won Best in Show, but a different piece, Blue Hydrangea, which some of you were looking at out in the gallery. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that piece before coming in, please do. And then just real quick, a little bit about Kate. She received her MFA in glass from the Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Philadelphia, and her BFA in painting from our very own Kansas City Art Institute. And currently, she's an artist in residence at Studios Inc., which is very close to here, and also teaches in foundations at KCAI. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for taking the time to come here and hear about my work. Thank you, Belger, for hosting and giving me this opportunity to share it. So this presentation has been structured to highlight some of the major themes within my work. I construct delicate and ornate large-scale paintings and installations comprised of kiln-fused glass panels. The wafer-thin panels reference nature and floral motifs. I'm drawn to these as there's a universality to flowers that crosses cultures and histories. And within each motif, I can build a narrative through the layered symbolisms and mythologies, stretching from ancient Greece to Shakespearean poetry and the language of flowers of the Victorian era. My work represents an exploration of nature through an intersection of class, modernity, and taste. There is a capacity for imitation and distinction, a juxtaposition of the artificial and the natural. Contained in controlled environments like this piece, Solarium, comments on the human desire to possess, shape, and control nature, all while it contradicts the inherent ephemerality of its life cycle. I'll often look to history as a source of inspiration. In the early mid-17th century, there was this Dutch phenomenon known as tulip mania. At the time, the economic wealth of the Dutch had increased so much that they looked for new ways to display it, which included the purchasing of tulips. And this application of value to the bulbs increased the desirability, which created the cycle of driving up the prices, and it actually was the first recorded asset bubble, where the asset prices widely deviated from the intrinsic value of the flower because of its ephemerality. At the center of this mania was the Semper Augustus breed, and what made this flower so desirable was these crimson splits in the petals, and those are actually caused by a virus that weakened the bulb, eventually leading to its own distinction. So they no longer exist, but we know that they are because of a lot of Dutch and Flemish paintings, still lifes feature these. I invite the viewer in through the work's beauty. There is, however, a darkness under the surface, a snake in the grass, bloodstains in the pattern, a world on fire. The work begins in small pieces. Each piece is placed in relation or reaction to the piece next to it. My aim is to create harmony, allowing for the work to become bigger than the sum of its parts. Because glass is transformative, it provides for an aha moment when the viewer discovers what the piece is made of. Prior to its reveal, most people are comfortable around the work. It feels very approachable through its beauty. But once they know it's glass, there becomes this sense of nervous tension viewer realizes the precariousness of what is being presented to them. What was first perceived as weightlessness becomes strained and brittle. This amber piece was actually my first exploration into large-scale installation. Quick side note, when I studied at KCAI, that's where I got introduced to glass, and I started making these glass tiaras and headdresses. So they were about human scale. And then I went to grad school and I did this. There was no in between. There was no gradual exploration of a medium-sized piece. And so I had no idea what I was doing. I had never made anything this big. And so I was hanging, all of these pieces are tied together and hung from the ceiling. So the top row is holding up the whole weight of this work. And because I had never done it before, there was so much tension in the work that some of the internal pieces actually exploded. And I thought this whole thing was going to fall, which was really bad because it was for my first review. It was the only thing I had. But instead, it kind of settled and did not fall. And I actually considered it a happy accident because with those holes being there, the shadows on the wall kind of fill in those gaps and the work completes itself. And I think that actually made it more interesting and more dynamic than how I originally had it. And now, shadows play a prominent role in my work. They can warp the viewer's perception on a piece's scale and density. This piece is large, but it's not as big as it feels, but with those shadows extending, it kind of feels like it's about to envelop the viewer. And translucent glass creates softer shadows that have particular hues to them, and they create a type of aura to the piece, and it causes like a visual vibration that really allows for the work to feel alive. I'm interested in how we transform nature into stylized designs that are brought into the home. I see them as ways of creating and constructing our own paradise, a way to possess flowers that never fade or succumb to decay. I'm drawn particularly to the Victorian era, as there was a societal disagreement of how nature should be emulated within the home. The arts and crafts movement was deeply disturbed by the popularity of these three-dimensional styles of wallpapers, china, and fabrics. As they served no function, all of a sudden flowers became deceitful and immoral because they tricked the eye. They were too believable. In Window to the World, I'm contrasting these two styles, a flat and impenetrable pattern from the arts and crafts movement with a naturalistic cabbage rose motif that really opens the wall up into like a window or a portal. The patterns have a cohesiveness through their color scheme. This is because while critics were concerned by aesthetics, the real danger lay in the components of the wallpaper. Manufacturers on both sides used arsenic to create the highly coveted brilliant greens and yellows of the time. So behind these beautiful and lush designs lurk layered histories of exclusivity, morality, and even death. Verdant was the first arsenic wallpaper piece. And I was drawn to this design as it was botanical, but it didn't feel floral. The leaves feel slightly autonomous. Within the work, the color shifts from the luminous green to the cream, and the pattern begins to feel kind of skeletal. The pumps begin to read like ribs, and the larger leaves, when mirrored, begin to read as pelvises. I'm interested in how we determine what good taste is and who gets to decide. In False Principles, the central flowers are taken from a fabric that was deemed so distasteful that it was included in an exhibition put on by the Victoria and Albert Museum to educate the public on what bad taste is. This was dubbed by the press at the time, this was like Victorian era, as as a chamber of horrors. Through their downfall, the blazing flowers demand the viewer's attention. And as the smoke breaks the barrier of the wallpaper plane, it is though the demise of both is inevitable. What reads as a clear image from far away begins to disintegrate and pull apart as the viewer approaches the work. The demise of style is when it reaches universal acceptance. It is the destruction of its significance, and it quickly turns kitsch. What makes things kitsch is their tangibility. There's no longer distance and longing, but instead accessibility and familiarity. Kitsch suggests hominess or a kind of clutter in which objects are assembled in an attempt to signify wealth and taste. In my work Sofa, I upholstered this piece with iron-on vinyl treated chintz. So I found this fabric, added the vinyl to it, and then upholstered it. I had help with the upholstery. And I don't know if you've ever experienced sitting on a plastic-covered sofa before, especially like in the summertime, with the backs of your legs sticking to it. It's not very pleasant. So why would we cover a sofa in plastic? It's because we want to keep it nice. We want to preserve it because it has to last. But it's through this very act of preservation that destroys whatever feeling of luxury it might have had if it had been left bare. I used chintz specifically because of its history. Initially, it was only to be found in palaces. This is Marie Antoinette's bedroom. It actually has many similarities with the sofa's fabric, with its trailing ribbons and bows and flowers, but over time it's fallen from a coveted and a desirable fabric into something intertwined with bad taste and kitsch. The glass beads attempt to follow a pattern, but they quickly become like growths spilling out of the sofa. It flirts between beauty and the grotesque, leaving the viewer to wonder, are the insides spilling out, or is there an outside element taking over this domestic object? Now, I personally prefer when glass doesn't look like glass, and it's not being used simply because it is glass. When it reads as wax, mold, or meat, it allows for the viewer to be rewarded with moments of discovery. So in 2019, I was accepted to Pilchuck Glass School's Emerging Artist in Residency program with a proposed project focusing on the Breeze Block. The Breeze Block is a decorative concrete block used to construct architectural screens that provide shade, privacy, and protection. The transformation of the cost-effective and purely functional cinder block into the decorative Breeze Block marked an important shift in American domestic architecture. In the 50s and 60s, these ornamental barriers dominated residential and commercial buildings, becoming intertwined with this concept of good life modernism, an idea that encouraged middle-class consumers to heighten their aesthetic sensibility and abandon their impulse towards kitsch and historicism. So moving away from sort of the stuffiness and the clutter of the Victorian era. My goal was to create these decorative blocks in kiln cast glass. And this is a process well outside my wheelhouse. If you notice, everything has been really thin, and these are thick. But I have a tendency for kind of dreaming big and figuring it out as I go. And I had no idea that this was an extremely complex mold. That the multiple holes and pores within the structure cause numerous stress points that makes the glass very easy to crack during the firing process. But because I didn't know, I wasn't deterred. But I did realize I was going to need help. This project was only made possible with the help of Ted Sawyer at Bullseye Glass and Daniel Clayman, who is a wizard at kiln casting. And they walked me through a lot of the mold making aspects, and as well as the kiln programming. And that's something I really appreciate about the glass community is this. It's a very generous community to be with. People share their knowledge very freely, I found. And so it worked. But because it's so thick, each firing took a week. So And this was a 6-week residency, so I can only make 6 blocks. And in the interim, I returned to working fast and thin, so I had something to do. And I ended up making these panels that I sewed together, and they became like these ghost-like breeze blocks. And so for years, the breeze block, as an architectural element, lay dormant, kind of relegated to this forgotten area in Middle Age called Middle Age architecture. And it's like not old enough to be deemed worthy of historic preservation, or young enough to feel fresh or innovative. It sort of hovered in this category of just old enough to seem tragically unstylish and dated. As with most fashions, though, there was a resurgence of the interest, kind of tied in with the interest of mid-century modern design. And this revitalization is not merely about taste, but I also think about it as being about mindset. I see the breeze block as a beautiful but dangerously nostalgic facade, rooted physically and conceptually in the strength of the middle class. The Frick breeze blocks are like shells, a shedded skin or a memory. They become representations of the promise of the American dream and the inability to possess it for so many today. We're going to get a little bit more into process. So I've been saying the word Frit a lot, and that's what I make my work with, and it's crushed glass. And this is probably the most action-packed photo of me ever taken making work. This was at a residency at S12 Gallery, Bergen, Norway, and the reason I'm normally not halfway in a kiln making my work, but their kiln was so big, it was really hard to take the kiln shelves out, so I just crawled in. It's actually a very quiet and sort of meditative process. Working directly on the kiln shelf, I sift, scatter, and push a sugary-like substance with really simple tools. I use a plastic spoon and a rubber tip clay tool to form dimensional drawings, and that's how every piece starts. So these are not expensive tools. I really like that there's a level of accessibility with it. I can meticulously lay out a pattern, but there's a wonderful loss of control as the material is transformed in the kiln through time and temperature. And this is something I've come to love about my process, that with each firing, there can be elements of surprise and discovery. There's a certain aspect of letting go of control, which I find very refreshing. I often say the kiln is like a present. It just depends on if it's a good one or a bad one, and you don't know until you open it. But even the bad ones, I like to file them away because they could be exactly what I need for a future piece. You know, sometimes if it gets a little weird with the color reaction, sometimes you want other work to get a little weird and it to get a little ugly. So I always take it as an opportunity that I've learned something and it could be applied to something along the road. So the once powdered material solidifies and contracts into this sort of crystalline web of glass. And its transformative qualities hide its own materiality. It allows for the glass to appear to be in action, growing or dying, melting or freezing. The composition of the work can be loose, soft, and intuitive, especially with the more organic forms, sort of like these cloud-like forms, and actually the blue hydrangea piece was similar. I think of it as like a back and forth conversation between me and the work. I can only fire so many parts in a day, and so it's a lot of putting things on the wall, moving them around, taking them out, putting them back in. The composition can change completely. Things break. Nothing is set in stone until it leaves the studio. Other times, though, it can be rigid, with crisp, sharp lines slicing through imagery, with color shifts that need to match up perfectly. These are where the split is happening. This isn't the same piece. They're two separate pieces that butt up against each other perfectly. and with something that kind of moves so freely in the film, it actually was harder than I thought it was going to be. But going back and forth between these methods really gives me a sense of balance within the studio. So if I'm feeling too constrained by this sort of rigid process, I can switch over and have a more intuitive making day, and vice versa. And it just keeps me coming back to the studio over and over and over again. I often get asked if I mix my colors, and in some way yes, in some way no. Print doesn't totally mix like paint, especially if you're working with like an opaque glass. That reads more like salt and pepper. But if you're working with transparent, and if they're sort of in a similar color field, you can create the illusion of an ombre or a soft blend kind of by combining them together with small ratios and kind of moving your way down and changing those ratios. So this was the piece that was in Heartland 6 last spring. Okay. So recent work has been installed on painted panels. This creates the opportunity for me to build an environment for the glass to live within that may have been impossible to execute using only glass from the way that I'm working with it. So all those thin straight lines and squares, the way that I'm working, it really hates to be that geometric. So why fight it? Let's use the right material. So I use paint instead. I've been using different hardware that allows me to layer the glass in a way that becomes akin to sort of like collage, and it creates a nice density that prior I'd only really been achieving through like the hanging curtain work. I've had a range of studios over the years. During the pandemic, I was working from a small home studio, which forced me to do small or crude digital sketching to figure out the work, especially when the work was larger than the actual studio. So I would pull from the specific historical patterns, editing the color palettes, and it really helped me see the work even before I began. With the naturalistic kind of cabbage rose motifs, these are made by carefully placing different colored frits next to each other to create shadow and form and highlights. I've started to call this color blocking. It's kind of like frit by numbers. There's no glue. There's no stencil. Nothing is holding this in place, and so like a sneeze, a sleeve, jewelry, wind can erase all of this work in an instant. And it's a really slow and delicate process, and it takes several hours for each panel. I was timing it because I was on a deadline, and it was about like 3 hours per panel. Whereas with the wallpaper pattern, I actually ended up using a drawing machine I sourced the imagery and kind of reduced it to the base elements that I needed, and then created it to make like a tile. So I would transfer this to the kiln shelf with carbon paper, and then sort of use that as my guide and go in and create the openings. And so I was at the home studio with this. So this was at Delaware Contemporary, and this is my first time seeing this in full completion with the paint and everything. And if only it was that fast to install. It's 12 feet across and 10.5 feet high. It's comprised of over 100 glass panels, and it's currently in the international exhibition held by Bullseye. It's called TG Transitions in Glass, which is at the Belger Artist Museum in Washington. There is an inherent desire to hold on to what is beautiful, but time, seasons, and life cycles make it impossible to do that. I believe that transformations and decay are visual ways of addressing the fleetingness of not only nature, but what it is to be human. While I was in grad school, I began to make wreaths with fresh flowers and fruit and encasing them in shrink wrap. The plastic becomes like a skin or a membrane. I was making this work alongside the sofa piece, so to me this was an act of preservation, but the plastic wrap is wrapped so tight that it actually speeds up the process of decay. The wreaths sweat and produce a small amount of heat that the viewer can actually feel when standing nearby. The once tight plastic begins to sag, becoming reminiscent of an aging body when they begin to smell, causing the work to become multi-sensory for the viewer. This work blurs the boundaries between body and object, beauty and repugnance, and the outer and the inner. In 2016, this was shortly after I graduated from Tyler, I was working in the restaurant industry in Philadelphia, and everybody has, they're working, but then we have the real thing that we do, or the other thing that we do. And so I discovered one of my coworkers casually mentioned that he was working at a funeral home, and I think he was surprised because I was like, can you tell me everything? And my first question was, what do they do with all the flowers? And what I found out was oftentimes there's just so many, it's overwhelming, and so the families can't take all of them. And they ended up being thrown away a lot of the times. So I embarked on a very awkward phone calling mission of calling up a lot of funeral homes in Philadelphia and asking them if they would give me the flowers that they were going to throw away. And sometimes it was a hard no, but other times, more often than not, they said yes. And I see these flowers to be signifiers of the last goodbyes to the departed, and I wanted to encapsulate them. Over the course of the installation, the flowers go through this huge transformation. There's so much moisture held within the vitrine that the condensation runs down the glass, almost like tears. And the mold grows into this soft fog, which becomes otherworldly. Going beyond what the objects are physically, they become representations of the lingering weight of grief and holding on past the point of reason. The flowers become transcendent of their own decay, and there is immense beauty. The first time I installed this, I was really surprised by that beauty. The decomposing flowers didn't smell bad. They smelled of the earth, wet dirt, familiar and almost comforting. I chose Beloved as the title because when I was removing all the ribbons and bows from the arrangements, the one word that kept repeating was beloved. Beloved husband, beloved mother, brother, wife. It seemed to be the one unifier, a reminder of our interconnectedness. A couple months after I first exhibited the piece, I went to Pilchuck to attend a neon bending workshop taught by Michael Hernandez, and I created this design during the first couple days. This was well beyond my skill level because I had never done it before, but I was hoping I was going to become an expert in 3 weeks. And my goal was to have this shown with the vitrine. And then I actually tried bending neon and discovered how hard it was. Luckily, early on, Michael invited a professional sign bender to come in and demo. And they asked if anyone had any challenging designs. And because I'm overeager, I was trying not to be. I kept my hand down for a minute, but then I was the only one who had drawn anything out yet. So I got to have him demo it, which was incredible. Because actually, I don't know if you've noticed, like looking at neon signs just around the city, a lot of times, especially longer words, it's either 2 or 3 segments is how they sort of break it up. And he was been a sign bender for 40 plus years, and he did it all in one, which if you've seen any neon bending, that's really insane. It was 3 feet long and about 1 foot tall. and this is it, bombarded and lit up. And so together, the neon really changed the feel of the flowers. It became a more immersive, reminiscent of being inside a mausoleum or some type of memorial. And this was installed at Bullseye for Beacon in 2017. And this piece below it, it's just like, you know how you have those mold and kind of freeze it in time like a Flemish painter with like a decomposing still life, which reminds the viewer of the transience of life, the futility of pleasure, the certainty of death. The mold becomes like dust that actually blocks light from filtering through the glass, and so in a way I see this diminishing the piece's aura and its sense of life. In ancient Greek mythology, Thanatos was the god that represented death personified. He was initially feared and hated by mortals and gods alike, but over time, Thanatos transformed from a symbol of merciless violence to being portrayed as a beautiful youth carrying a butterfly, and in ancient Greek, the word butterfly and soul are the same. The work feels weightless as the black glass is being lifted up off the wall, kind of like peeling back wallpaper. And I wanted to capture this softer, more gentle interpretation of death instead of it feeling ominous. The dark cloud envelops and gently cradles the butterflies. I use the seductive qualities of glass to draw the viewer in. It glistens and has a lusciousness that becomes candy-like. But upon further inspection, the viewer discovers that something isn't quite right. What reads as pattern from far away falls apart and becomes more like festering wounds that ooze and drip. The fragility of the glass becomes metaphorical for the fragility of the body. There's this delicate intricacy to that of lace which has been spoiled. It dominates the space, yet its fragility literally is hanging on by threads, reminding the viewer that there is no beauty without decay. The work creates an ever-present anxiety because there's this constant feeling of the potential of loss. Grasped too tightly and it will shatter. So last year I was invited to create and install my first public piece at Paul Gardens, and I wanted to capture the wonder and sense of awe that nature can instill in us. I focused primarily on tropical foliage. For many people, especially here in the Midwest, these plants exist only as houseplants that remain contained in pots of a certain size. And prior to this, I had the opportunity to go to Miami, and I got to see the plants in their true environment and at immense scale. It was so inspiring. I knew that these were the botanicals I really wanted to work with. And what was so exciting about working with Pal was it wasn't just me coming and sticking my work in the space. I was having back and forth conversations with the gardeners about what plants I was using and how they could bring that in. And so it felt like it was a full, the whole thing, the whole space was this collaborative work of art. It was extremely challenging to see this work in the studio because of how high the ceilings were in the atrium and the scale. I was trying to map the piece on the wall and it wasn't making any sense. So I created this small mock-up and began to see its potential and, learn to trust myself. And what excited me about this project is that it allowed for me to revisit the floating aspect of my work while really pushing me to see the piece from multiple angles before all the floating stuff was sort of one plane. And I wanted to make a radial tropical explosion of life. These books were 18 feet across. And as you move around the work, there's always something new to discover. The wafer-thin panels sort of disappear into the air at certain angles, only to reveal new composition. So it's inviting the viewer to kind of walk around and interact with the piece. There's a lot of joy in this piece. At times, that was hard hard for me to channel because making this work coincided with my dad's losing battle with pancreatic cancer. And trying to go into studios and create work that doesn't necessarily reflect how you're feeling can be challenging in the sense of like, is this sincere, is this true? It made me question myself as a maker and what the piece was doing. But once we got the work in that space, I was so grateful that those were the emotions I had channeled with this piece and in that space. They extended the exhibition to overlap with the Festival of Butterflies, and having hundreds of butterflies in the same space as my work was really this like dream come true. And when I went to see it, I was looking for them, and I didn't see any, and I was like really confused and disappointed. And then I looked up and I realized that they were all resting on the glass flowers instead of the real ones. And that moment caught me in my chest and really reminded me that even though there are so many hard things in the world right now, on so many levels, that I like to think that this work and artwork in general can welcome people in to take time to slow down, to sit and contemplate, and with this piece, like to look up, but not only at the work, but at like the sun and the moving clouds and the butterflies, and allow a small moment for wonder and awe.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone for showing up. We really appreciate it. So have a wonderful night. Walk through the gallery for a little bit, and yeah, thanks for coming. We'll see you for things coming up. We've got lots of stuff, so check out belgerarts.org for other events.
Basically, once the piece is done in the studio, I trace it directly on the wall, and then take all the parts down, and then put the gear chart up, and trace that with a Sharpie, and then this perfectly to scale map that when I go and install the work, no matter where I'm at, like it'll be the same every time. But it's been a learning system, yeah.
Did you ask the gardeners if they had a theory on why the butterflies prefer your flowers to the real flowers?
No, but I was wondering if maybe it was because they were warm because of the sun. Like the glass would kind of heat
surprising, yeah. Well, okay. If you have any other questions and just want to come up to me, that's cool too. Thank you so much for coming.